The hum of the cooling systems was my constant companion, a low, steady thrum that vibrated through the floorboards of the observatory. It was a familiar sound, a reassuring rhythm in the vast, silent canvas of the cosmos I spent my nights observing. For years, this isolated dome had been my sanctuary, my crucible, my entire world. I, Marcus, had willingly traded the clamor of cities and the warmth of human proximity for the cold, stark beauty of the void. My meticulous existence revolved around the slow drift of galaxies, the birth pangs of stars, the echoes of phenomena that had transpired millennia before my own ancestors had even crawled from the primordial muck. My routine was a ritual honed over decades. Coffee, black and bitter, brewed exactly at 22:00. A final check of the external weather sensors. Then the careful calibration of the instruments, the gentle whir of gears as the primary dish tilted, hungry for distant whispers. Tonight, like every night, I settled into my worn leather chair, the glow of the monitors casting an anemic light on my face. The data streamed in, an endless cascade of numbers and graphs, a language only I truly understood. I sought patterns, anomalies, anything that deviated from the expected cosmic background noise. Most nights I found nothing. Just the elegant, predictable dance of universal mechanics. It was heavier, laced with an almost imperceptible static, like the air before a storm. My fingers, accustomed to the precise movements of the keyboard, paused mid-stroke. I leaned closer to the primary monitor, my gaze fixed on the spectral analysis graph. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the baseline. It was so subtle, so fleeting, I almost dismissed it as a transient equipment glitch, a stray particle hitting the sensor. I often saw such things. My colleagues, if I still had any close ones, would have laughed it off. I rewound the feed, isolating the millisecond of disturbance. There it was again, a ghostly spike, barely rising above the noise floor. It wasn't random. There was a peculiar, almost rhythmic quality to its appearance, a tiny, stuttering heartbeat in the otherwise smooth rhythm of the universe. My scientific curiosity, a relentless engine within me, ignited. I ran a series of filters, peeling back layers of expected cosmic interference, painstakingly trying to isolate the source. The hum of the cooling system seemed to grow louder, or perhaps it was just the blood rushing in my ears. Hours bled into each other. My eyes, usually dry and gritty by dawn, felt unusually alert, almost feverish. The data, once a comforting flow, began to twist into something unsettling. The faint tremor was not a single event, it was a series, a sequence. And as I stripped away more and more of the background, as I refined my algorithms, the pattern solidified. It was structured, not the chaotic burst of a supernova, nor the elegant pulse of a pulsar. This was deliberate. My breath hitched. I zoomed in then out, cycling through frequencies, cross-referencing against every known celestial phenomenon. It didn't fit. Nothing I had ever studied, nothing I had ever read about, bore any resemblance to this intricate, repeating sequence. It was a language, perhaps, or a complex mathematical construct, but utterly alien in its origin. The signal wasn't from within our galaxy. It wasn't even from a neighboring galaxy, and the age estimate based on the redshift and the sheer distance was incomprehensible. Billions upon billions of years, older than our own sun, older than our galaxy itself. I stared at the glowing figures on the screen, my mind struggling to reconcile the impossible. A structured signal, ancient beyond imagining. Who or what could have sent such a thing? The implications were enormous, terrifying. My hands trembled, a slight, uncontrollable tremor that spread from my fingertips to my forearms. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a violation of everything I understood about existence. The first rays of dawn, pale and hesitant, began to paint the eastern sky. I left the observatory, the data still scrolling endlessly on the monitors, a silent testament to my shattering discovery. I didn't go home, not to my small, Spartan cottage. Instead, I drove almost unconsciously to the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years. The heavy oak doors, familiar since childhood, creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty nave. The stained glass windows, usually vibrant with morning light, remained muted, the rising sun still too low to properly ignite their ancient stories. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams that pierced the gloom. It was a place of human scale, of human understanding, built on foundations of faith that had weathered countless storms. But what faith, what understanding could possibly encompass what I had found? My scientific mind, trained to dissect and categorize, found itself utterly adrift. The signal wasn't just data. It was a question, an immense, echoing query from the deepest reaches of time and space. And I was the only one who had heard it, who had sent this message. And why, after so many eons, had it finally reached me? The hum of the cooling systems at the observatory had become a distant memory, replaced by the frantic whir of my own servers, tucked away in the dusty silence of the vestry. I had brought the core data here, to the church where my family had been clergy for 400 years. A place of worn stone and echoing quiet that felt, paradoxically, safer than the exposed dome under the indifferent stars. Here, surrounded by generations of sermons and sacred texts, I hoped to ground myself, to find some human context for the inhuman thing I had stumbled upon. Days bled into nights. The scent of old parchment and beeswax, usually comforting, now mingled with the acrid tang of ozone from the overworked machines. My fingers, stained with coffee and the faint grime of constant keyboard use, flew across the keys, sifting through terabytes of raw signal data. Each spectral line, each frequency modulation, each tiny fluctuation in amplitude was a word in a language I didn't know, a glyph in an alphabet that defied every linguistic principle I had ever studied. Initially, I approached it like any unknown transmission, looking for prime numbers, mathematical constants, or even simple binary sequences. I found nothing familiar. Instead, the patterns were fluid, recursive, almost organic. They shifted subtly when I tried to isolate them, like trying to grasp smoke. My initial excitement, that heady rush of discovery, curdled into a persistent, low-grade unease. This wasn't just complex, it was obdurate. I started seeing shapes in the waveform graphs that shouldn't exist, fractals that folded into themselves in non-Euclidean ways, geometries that implied more dimensions than I could perceive. My eyes burned, tracing lines that seemed to subtly alter their paths when I looked away, only to snap back into place when I refocused. It was an optical illusion, I told myself, a symptom of exhaustion, but the feeling of being observed by the data itself began to cling to me, a cold film on my skin. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I tried cross-referencing the signal with every known natural phenomenon: pulsars, quasars, cosmic background radiation. No match. I even looked into theoretical physics, searching for exotic particles or gravitational anomalies that might produce such a signature. Still nothing. The signal wasn't just anomalous, it was defiant. It mocked every scientific model I possessed. Then came the linguistic analysis. I fed segments of the signal into algorithms designed to detect syntax, semantics, and underlying grammatical structures. The results were baffling. The signal exhibited a kind of self-referential grammar, where the meaning of a word seemed to be encoded within its own waveform, and its position in a sentence would subtly alter the meaning of every other word around it. It wasn't a linear language. It was a holographic one, where every part contained the whole, and the whole was constantly redefining its parts. This wasn't merely intelligent. It was alien in a way that shattered my understanding of intelligence itself. It wasn't just a different language. It was a different way of thinking, a fundamental re-architecture of logic. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered with a desperate intensity. My hands trembled as I isolated a particularly complex sequence. It pulsed, not just in amplitude, but in a way that implied a rhythmic expansion and contraction across multiple, indiscernible dimensions. It was a pattern of impossible recurrence, a loop that never truly repeated, always slightly different, always growing more intricate. I felt a profound shift within me, a subtle loosening of the anchors that held my perception of reality in place. The signal wasn't just conveying information, it was rearranging it, not just in the data stream, but in my own mind as I processed it. My headache was constant now, a dull throb behind my eyes that worsened whenever I focused on the signal's more paradoxical elements. One evening, as the last sliver of twilight bled through the stained glass window depicting a shepherd and his flock, I noticed something new. Embedded within one of the recurring fractal patterns, a faint, almost subliminal pulse. It was too regular to be random noise, too subtle to be an error. I amplified it, isolated it, ran it through every filter I could conceive. What emerged wasn't a sound or a visual pattern or even a mathematical sequence. It was a process, a series of transformations that, when played back, seemed to undo the previous transformations, only to then re-establish them in a slightly altered form. It was a constant state of becoming and unbecoming, a perpetual self-correction. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a message. It was a directive. An instruction embedded within the very fabric of the signal. It wasn't asking for a response. It was demonstrating something. I leaned back away from the glowing screen, my chair scraping loudly on the flagstones. The ancient crucifix on the wall, usually a symbol of comfort, now seemed to twist, its figure contorted in silent agony. My gaze fell upon a dusty, leather-bound book, one of my ancestors' journals, filled with elegant, looping script detailing the spiritual struggles of his congregation. His world, his faith, felt impossibly distant, a fragile shield against the cosmic indifference I was now confronting. The signal was not merely from beyond our galaxy, it was from beyond our understanding of existence. It was a blueprint for an impossible kind of change. What was it trying to correct? And what would happen if it succeeded? The ancient stones of the church where my family had been clergy for 400 years seemed to press in on me, not with the weight of history, but with a different, cold pressure. The vestry, usually a place of quiet reflection, had become my bunker. Cables snaked across the worn flagstones, connecting my portable servers to the church's archaic power grid. The hum of the machines was a faint counterpoint to the deep, pervasive silence that clung to the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. I had spent days, then nights, poring over the data. The signal, stripped bare of all terrestrial interference, remained an impossible construct. Its structure defied every known principle of astrophysics. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, an antiquity that dwarfed the very concept of life on Earth. And the patterns? I had isolated repeating motifs, complex, self-similar fractals that seemed to fold in on themselves, hinting at dimensions my instruments couldn't even register. My scientific training was a cage, and this signal was an entity that existed entirely outside its bars. The equations I tried to force onto it crumbled into nonsense. My hands, usually steady, trembled as I scrolled through lines of incomprehensible data. This was not a problem to be solved with a telescope and a supercomputer. The air grew heavy with the scent of old paper and beeswax from the stacks of hymnals and forgotten ledgers. My gaze drifted to a dusty shelf, laden with texts no one had touched in decades. Parish records, theological treatises, and a scattering of local histories bound in brittle leather. She used to consult with an antiquarian in the city, a man who dealt in the truly obscure, not just rare books but forgotten lore. The thought settled in my mind like a stone dropped into still water. What if the answer wasn't in physics but in history? The idea felt like a betrayal of everything I had dedicated my life to, yet the signal offered no other path. I needed to seek out the forgotten, the discarded, the knowledge that science had deemed irrelevant. I needed the antiquarian. The antiquarian's shop was tucked away on a narrow side street, a place that seemed to actively repel sunlight. Its windows were grimy, displaying a random assortment of brass instruments, yellowed maps, and a taxidermied owl with unsettlingly bright glass eyes. The bell above the door gave a faint, mournful chime as I entered. The air inside was thick with the smell of aged paper leather, and something else, a faint metallic tang, like old coins or dried blood. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the gloom. Bookshelves soared to the ceiling, crammed with tomes of every size and vintage, their spines a chaotic tapestry of forgotten languages and obscure titles. Behind a counter piled high with scrolls and strange artifacts sat a man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He looked up, his eyes, magnified by the lenses, seeming to bore directly into me. Lost or looking for something truly lost, the antiquarian rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I'm looking for old knowledge, not scientific, something. Pre-human, cosmic fears, perhaps. I tried to keep my voice even, but a tremor betrayed me. I pulled out a printout, a simplified representation of the signal's most recurring pattern, a complex asymmetrical spiral that seemed to coil endlessly inward. Have you ever encountered anything like this symbol, or a description of something? Vast and utterly alien, yet somehow structured. The antiquarian took the paper, his gnarled fingers tracing the spiral. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if seeing through the paper to something far beyond. A shiver ran down my arm. He sighed, a sound heavy with an unspoken weariness. This form, it is not unknown, not in the annals of common history, no. It looked like it had been handled by countless uneasy hands. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle and yellowed. The script was unlike anything I had ever seen, a looping, angular hand that seemed to writhe on the page. But there, emblazoned across a crumbling parchment, was a diagram. It was crude, drawn with uncertain lines, but unmistakable. The same impossible, coiling spiral. Beneath it, in a script that I recognized as an ancient proto-language, was a single word repeated endlessly. Anomalous. My breath hitched, my vision blurred. It was not just a symbol, it was a blueprint. The exact, impossible geometry of the signal depicted in a text so ancient it predated recorded civilization. This wasn't a coincidence. This was recognition. My hands clenched, the printout crumpling. This meant that whatever was sending the signal, whatever entity was communicating across the gulfs of space and time, was not a new discovery. It had been seen before. It had been feared before, only acknowledged. I stared at the closed book, then back at the antiquarian, my mind reeling. But what had the old one seen, and what did this anomaly truly signify? The antiquarian's words still echoed, a discordant chime against the ordered hum of my scientific mind. Anomalous, a force not of nature, but against it, a correction. My hands trembled, clutching the ancient leather-bound book, its pages whispering of a terror far older than recorded history. The signal, that impossible, structured sequence from the void, was not merely data. It was a key. A key to what? And what had the old ones truly glimpsed that had driven them to such elaborate, desperate warnings? The city outside the dusty shop felt brittle. A thin veneer stretched over something vast and indifferent. Sounds seemed to carry further, or perhaps my ears were simply hyper-tuned to the unsettling quiet between them. I walked, not truly seeing, my thoughts a frenzied orbit around the word anomalous, a cosmic entity correcting the fundamental laws of existence. The concept was a poison in my intellect, unraveling everything I had ever built my understanding upon. I found myself at the heavy oak doors of the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years. The air inside was cool, smelling of old stone, beeswax, and a faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay that clung to the ancient tapestries. The stained glass windows, depicting scenes of quiet piety, cast fractured rainbows across the worn flagstones. Here, in this bastion of steadfast faith and ancestral memory, I hoped to find some anchor against the intellectual maelstrom. I moved through the familiar nave, my footsteps muffled. My gaze fell upon the altar, specifically the communion chalice, a heavy silver vessel that had been passed down through generations. It was always kept in the exact center of the altar, gleaming under the single spotlight from above. But now it wasn't. It sat a few inches to the left, nestled slightly behind a candlestick. A trivial displacement. I frowned, my brow furrowed, and reached out to adjust it. I distinctly remembered polishing it myself just yesterday, placing it back precisely in its spot. I was meticulous, compulsively so. My hand hesitated, then completed the movement, centering the chalice. I stepped back, my eyes narrowed. Had I been so distracted yesterday that I'd made such a basic error? It was unlike me. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt a hairline fracture appear. A tiny, insignificant crack. I tried to dismiss it, blaming my recent sleepless nights, the relentless analysis of the signal, the unsettling revelations of the antiquarian. My gaze drifted to the high archways, the intricate carvings on the pulpit. The familiar lines of Gothic architecture should have been a comfort. Instead, as I looked at the intersection of two ancient stone arches above the chancel, something flickered. For a bare instant, the lines seemed to bend inward, creating an impossible angle, a convergence that defied the very laws of perspective. A corner that shouldn't exist. My breath caught. My vision swam. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them until white spots danced behind my eyelids. When I opened them again, the arches were normal, sturdy, and reassuringly Euclidean. My stomach churned. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, or perhaps my brain, pushed to its limits, was simply misfiring. But the unease lingered, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. How could I trust my own perception if even the solid, unchanging stone of this ancient church could warp before my eyes? Sleep, when it finally came, offered no respite. My dreams were not the disjointed, hazy narratives of a tired mind. They were vivid, stark, and utterly alien. Geometric forms, impossible to describe, shifted and reconfigured themselves, not moving but simply becoming. A cube might unfold into a hyperdimensional lattice, then contract into a point, only to erupt into a complex, self-intersecting structure that defied all understanding of volume and dimension. There was no sound, yet I felt a pressure, a pervasive presence that sought to reorder, to align. It was not malicious, not angry, but utterly indifferent, like a sculptor correcting a flawed block of marble. And I was the marble. My own mind felt like a raw nerve exposed to this vast, correcting force. I felt my own perceptions, my very understanding of space and time, being stretched, thinned, and rewoven into patterns that were fundamentally wrong, yet undeniably real within the dream. I saw flashes of the signal not as data, but as pure, unadulterated intent, a relentless pulse driving this cosmic reordering. It was a mental intrusion, direct and unfiltered, bypassing the usual filters of the subconscious. The metallic taste in my mouth was back, stronger this time, like I had been chewing on old copper. The room, my familiar rectory bedroom attached to the church, felt alien. I sat upright, my heart racing, struggling to orient myself. The air was still heavy. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint, almost transparent shimmer in the air near the wardrobe, like heat haze, but sharper, with an impossible edge. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that the dreams were bleeding into my waking world. Enough to tell me that the Anomalous was not just a concept, not just a signal, but an encroaching reality. What was happening to me? And what would be left when it was done? The ancient leather of the book still felt cold against my palms, even hours later as I sat hunched in a pew of the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years. The vast, echoing space offered no comfort. Stained glass saints, their faces fractured by lead lines, stared down with serene, unseeing eyes. The scent of old wood, dust, and beeswax usually brought a sense of peace, a connection to generations of quiet devotion. Tonight, it only amplified my isolation. The antiquarian's hushed warnings, the chilling resonance of Anomalous, played over and over in my mind, a frantic, discordant loop. A force against nature. A correction. How could such an archaic concept so perfectly mirror the impossible structure I had observed? The signal that defied every known law of physics, the pattern that was too perfect. My scientific training screamed for an explanation, for a rational framework to contain the encroaching chaos. But the rational framework was collapsing. The universe, a vast, elegant machine of predictable forces, was now revealing a hidden, malignant gear. I needed to understand, not just the what, but the why. He had spoken of a scholar, a former academic whose reputation had been shredded years ago, dismissed as a purveyor of esoteric nonsense. A man who, in his disgrace, had retreated into a self-imposed exile, hoarding forgotten texts and forbidden knowledge. A man who might have seen something similar in the tangled skein of history, something that might illuminate the cosmic horror now unfolding before me. The journey was a blur of highway miles and deepening twilight. My car ate up the distance, the hum of the engine a monotonous drone against the frantic thrumming in my chest. I drove west, towards the forgotten edges of the city, where the grid fractured into winding, unlit roads. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to a gravel track, overgrown with weeds, ending at a ramshackle house swallowed by a thicket of ancient, gnarled trees. The air here was heavy, still, carrying the damp, earthy smell of decay and something else, a faint metallic tang like old blood or ozone. This was not a place of quiet contemplation, but of brooding obsession. I knocked again harder, the knuckles of my hand aching against the splintered wood. A shuffling sound from within, a creak. What do I want? The voice was a gravelly rasp, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. My name is Marcus, I began, my voice feeling thin and reedy in the sudden quiet. I was told. I need to speak with I about certain irregularities, things that defy the known order. The eye regarded me for a long moment, then the door opened wider. The figure who stood before me was a ghost of a man, gaunt and stooped, his sparse hair a wild, white halo around a skull-like face. His clothes were stained and rumpled, smelling of stale paper and something acrid like burnt sugar. Dust motes danced in the weak glow, a silent, frantic ballet. He led me to a cleared space, a small island in the sea of books where a worn armchair faced another. He sat, his movements stiff, deliberate. His eyes, though bloodshot, held a startling intensity. Irregularities, he repeated, a faint, humorless smile playing on his lips. A polite word for the unraveling, isn't it? My breath caught. I have seen the threads fray. I have read the accounts of those who saw it before. The Anomalous, the great correction. He paused, his gaze fixed on me, piercing. I have seen it, haven't I? Not in some dusty tome, but with my own eyes, through my instruments, the impossible pattern. My hands began to tremble. How could he know I hadn't uttered a single scientific term? I've detected a structure, a pattern that shouldn't exist. From beyond our galaxy, it's deliberate. The former academic nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if seeing beyond the walls of his cluttered room. They always start subtly, a ripple in the fabric. Then the laws begin to bend, gravity shifts, time wavers, the very light from distant stars takes on a wrong hue. He shuddered, a deep, racking movement. It's not an entity in the way I understand it. It is an intention, a will, a fundamental correction of what it perceives as an error in existence itself. My mind reeled, an error in existence. Was he speaking of God, of the universe's very blueprint? What kind of correction? I managed, my voice hoarse. It seeks to simplify, to reduce, to bring all things back to a state of nothingness, or perhaps a different alien form of being, a state where our complex, chaotic reality has no place. His gaze sharpened, focusing on my face with an unnerving intensity. Those who perceive it, those who understand it, they are the first to unravel. Their minds shatter, unable to reconcile the impossible with the real. My skin prickled. This wasn't madness, this was a horrifying echo of my own growing conviction. My scientific detachment, my careful objectivity was crumbling into dust. "What happens then?" I asked, my throat tight. "When the unraveling begins?" He leaned back, a vacant look replacing the intensity in his eyes. "The old texts are vague, of stars winking out, of the very concept of here and there losing meaning. It's not destruction, Marcus, it's reordering." I wanted to argue, to demand evidence, but the weight of his words, combined with my own observations, pressed down on me like a physical force. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken horrors. My chest ached. My hands, still trembling, felt clammy. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked, the question feeling futile even as I voiced it. He simply shook his head, a slow, weary gesture. "I cannot stop a cosmic tide, Marcus. I can only watch it rise, or perhaps, if I am truly unfortunate, I can understand it." He looked at me again, his eyes holding a profound, ancient sorrow. "I have begun to understand, haven't I? And now what will I do with that understanding?" The question hung in the stale air, a heavy, suffocating shroud. What indeed? The silence of the church, where my family has been clergy for 400 years, was usually a balm, a cool, stone embrace against the clamor of the world. Now it was a hollow chamber, amplifying the insidious whispers that crawled from my equipment. The air, thick with the scent of aged oak and forgotten incense, felt charged, expectant. I hadn't slept in days, not truly. My eyelids were gritty sandpaper, my head a drum. I hunched over the main console, fingers stained with graphite and dried sweat. The display pulsed with the familiar rhythmic patterns of the signal, a complex tapestry of frequencies and modulations. For weeks, it had been a puzzle, an enigma of cosmic proportions. I'd isolated recurring motifs, sequences that repeated with subtle, unnerving variations. Not random noise, not natural phenomenon. These were deliberate. Someone or something had crafted this. This wasn't just data, it was syntax. It possessed a grammar, a terrifying, alien logic. My breath hitched. But then, a flicker of insight, a pattern recognition that felt less like a scientific breakthrough and more like a fever dream. It resonated. It echoed something deep within my own mind, a structure that felt fundamental. It wasn't a language in any terrestrial sense, no discrete words or phonemes. It was a symphony of pure concept, a resonant frequency that conveyed meaning through its very vibration. I closed my eyes, pressing my temples, and I could hear it, not through the speakers, but in the cavernous space behind my eyes. It was the entity's song, and it was singing to me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My hands trembled, hovering above the keyboard. Why me? Why this remote corner of existence, this ancient hallowed space? The signal, previously a distant phenomenon, now felt intensely personal, a direct address. I scrolled through the deciphered fragments, my eyes blurring. They weren't translations, not exactly. They were impressions, overwhelming surges of pure information that my mind struggled to contain. Concepts of scale so vast they fractured my understanding of dimension. Ideas of time that rendered millennia as fleeting blinks. What kind of correction? The thought made my stomach churn. My vision swam. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight. The old wood groaned faintly beneath my weight, a tiny protest against the impossible weight of this revelation. It wasn't benevolent. It wasn't malevolent. It simply was, and its existence implied a purpose that dwarfed and utterly dismissed humanity. My skin crawled. I felt like an ant under a cosmic magnifying glass, not even worthy of being burned, merely observed, deemed irrelevant. Fragments of its terrifying purpose started to coalesce, like ice crystals forming on a window pane. It wasn't about destruction, not in the way we understood it. It was about an unraveling, a reweaving of reality itself, a cosmic reset. And everything I knew, everything humanity had built, every star in the sky, was merely a temporary, flawed iteration. My throat was dry, raw. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. The song filled my head, a beautiful, terrible cadence that threatened to shatter my sanity. It conveyed an indifference so profound it was more terrifying than any hatred. We were less than dust, less than a forgotten dream. Our very existence was an error, an imperfection to be smoothed away. My eyes fell upon a particularly stark pattern, a sequence that repeated with an almost hypnotic regularity. As I stared, a single horrifying thought bloomed in my mind, a truth so absolute it eclipsed all others. What if the correction wasn't something to be done to the universe, but rather something that was the universe, simply reasserting its true nature? What then of everything we thought we knew? The air, thick with the scent of aged oak and forgotten incense, clung to my skin like a shroud. My eyes, raw and gritty from sleepless nights, scanned the familiar space. The wooden pews, polished smooth by generations of hands, seemed to ripple at the edges of my vision. A trick of the light, I told myself, a consequence of exhaustion. Yet the sensation persisted, a subtle distortion like looking through heat haze on a summer road, but here indoors in the cool, still air. The faint, high-pitched whine from the console, barely audible to anyone else, was a constant companion, a dull ache behind my temples. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a pressure, a persistent hum that resonated in my very bones, making my teeth ache. I tried to focus on the data scrolling across the monitor, a dense tapestry of frequencies and waveforms that no human mind was ever meant to decipher. Each spike, each dip, felt weighted with a terrible significance, a cosmic secret yearning to escape its digital prison. The patterns, once abstract scientific notation, now seemed to coalesce into impossible geometries, shifting and expanding in my peripheral vision. I blinked hard, forcing my gaze directly onto the screen. The patterns dissolved back into numbers, sterile and inert. But the feeling of them, the impression of something vast and utterly wrong, lingered. My hand trembled as I reached for the lukewarm coffee mug. The ceramic felt alien against my fingers, its smooth surface suddenly rough, almost granular. Was that really me? A sudden sharp clang echoed from the back of the church. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. Nothing, just the wind perhaps, rattling a loose pane in the stained glass window depicting St. Michael. But then, as I watched, the vibrant reds and blues of St. Michael's tunic seemed to deepen, to bleed into the surrounding leaded lines. His painted eyes, usually fixed in benevolent contemplation, now seemed to hold a predatory glint, following my movements with an unsettling intensity. My breath hitched. It was just glass, just paint, just old light. Yet the illusion was so potent, so real, that I found myself taking a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron candlestick on the nearby altar. The morning light, usually a comforting presence filtering through the ancient windows, now felt intrusive, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, unseen particles of the signal itself. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Later that day, a colleague, a historian studying the church's archives, found me huddled beneath the pulpit, my back pressed against the cold stone. "Marcus," the historian asked, their voice a distant echo in the vast space. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I flinched, the sound of their approach unheard until they were almost upon me. "Ghost." I repeated, the word tasting like ash. No ghosts, just... I watched their eyes, searching for a sign, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps complicity. Were they part of it? Did they know? The historian knelt, their brow furrowed with concern. "I haven't slept, have I? Not making sense. Why are I down here?" Their hand reached out tentatively to touch my shoulder. I recoiled violently, scrambling back against the cold stone. "Don't touch me." The words tore from my throat, raw and desperate. Their face, once a picture of mild concern, now seemed to twist, the lines around their mouth deepening into something predatory, their eyes narrowing with a knowing glint. The air around them shimmered just for a moment. I could almost hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the signal emanating from their very being. There's no one else here. Just us. I need to get some rest." They stood slowly, backing away, their movements cautious. I watched them retreat, my gaze fixed on their back. They were leaving, they were escaping, or perhaps they were just reporting back. The thought curdled in my gut. The signal wasn't just something I was observing, it was observing me. And it was using everything around me, every familiar face, every comforting object, to twist my perception, to make me doubt the very ground beneath my feet. The historian's footsteps faded, leaving me alone once more in the echoing vastness of the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years. It was a suffocating weight, a vast, empty chamber resonating with the entity's unseen presence. My own mind, once a fortress of reason and logic, felt like a crumbling edifice, its foundations eroded by an impossible tide. What was real, and what was merely a reflection of the unraveling within me? The whispers followed the historian, a faint, rustling tide receding with their cautious steps. "Marcus, what are I talking about? Just us. I need to get some rest." Their voice, though soft, felt like a judgment. I watched their back, the slight tremble in their shoulders as they moved away, leaving me alone in the cold, echoing space of the observation chamber. Had I imagined it? Had the strain finally fractured something inside me? The historian's retreat was a clear message, a dismissal of my reality. But the signal, the patterns, the sheer impossibility of it all, that wasn't imagination. I stumbled out of the facility, the night air biting at my exposed skin. The stars, usually a comforting blanket of familiar pinpricks, now felt like the eyes of something vast and indifferent. My own apartment, usually a refuge, felt too small, too filled with the ghosts of my calculations and the spectral glow of my monitors. I needed a different kind of sanctuary, a place steeped in permanence, in a history far older than my own fleeting discoveries. The church where my family has been clergy for 400 years stood silhouetted against the bruised pre-dawn sky. The heavy oak doors groaned on their hinges as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the nave. The air inside was thick, smelling of beeswax, dust, and something else, something metallic and faintly damp, like old earth disturbed. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my footsteps loud on the worn flagstones. Each pew, each carved wooden relief felt intensely familiar, a tangible connection to generations of my lineage who had sought solace and understanding within these walls. I stopped before the altar, the polished wood gleaming faintly in the gloom. A single vigil candle left burning from the evening service, flickered weakly in its holder. Its flame, usually a steady spear of light, wavered with an unnatural languor, bending slightly, not towards any draft, but in an impossible, subtle curve. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my eyes fixed on the struggling light. It was as if the very air around it had thickened, become viscous, resisting its upward climb. I reached out a hand, feeling for a breeze, but there was none. The air was utterly still, yet the flame continued its strange, impossible lean. I felt a pressure, subtle at first, behind my eyes, a dull throb that intensified with each beat of my pulse. The floor beneath my feet seemed to shift imperceptibly, a microscopic tilt that made my balance falter. I gripped the edge of a pew, my grip tight. Was I dizzy, exhausted, or was this something else? My weight felt unfamiliar, as if gravity itself had become a variable and unstable force. For a moment, my feet felt impossibly heavy, rooted to the stone, then a fleeting lightness. A sense of being on the verge of floating made my stomach clench. I looked around the cavernous space. They stretched, then recoiled, independent of the feeble light from the candle and the faint sliver of dawn seeping through the high windows. The very fabric of the air seemed to shimmer, a barely perceptible distortion like looking through heat haze, but without the heat. Colors, even the muted grays and browns of the interior, appeared duller, as if a filter had been placed over my perception, draining the world of its vibrancy. They weren't words, not exactly, but a resonant frequency that vibrated deep within my chest, a low thrum that spoke of immense, unimaginable scale. It felt like a vast, unseen engine was starting, its vibrations rippling through the very bedrock of existence. The pressure in my head became a sharp ache, and a metallic taste bloomed on my tongue. This wasn't just a signal anymore. This wasn't a distant observation. The entity wasn't merely transmitting. It was here, or rather its influence was. The gravitational anomalies, the distorted air, the impossible bending of a candle flame, these were not random occurrences. They were symptoms, harbingers. A wave of nausea washed over me. The entity was approaching. It was coming. What did it mean for reality itself when its very constants began to fray? What would happen when the entity finally arrived? The historian's retreating back was a wall, solid and unyielding, even as the faint, rustling whispers seemed to cling to the very fabric of my clothes. No one else here, just us. Their words echoed, a hollow mockery of my reality. My own breath hitched, a dry rasp in my throat. It pressed in, a physical weight, suffocating. My hands, I noticed, were trembling, a faint tremor that started in my fingertips and worked its way up my forearms. I had to do something. I had to make someone understand. My first thought was a colleague, a specialist in exoplanetary atmospheres, someone whose mind I respected, who dealt with the fringes of the known. I retreated to my private terminal, fingers fumbling over the secure interface. I typed, a frantic stream of consciousness, detailing the impossible signal, the underlying structure, the creeping certainty of its purpose. I spoke of the correction, of the unraveling, the way reality felt thin, stretched. I attached the latest data streams, the anomalies, the statistical impossibilities that screamed of an intelligence beyond human comprehension. I waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. My office, usually a sanctuary of ordered chaos, felt like a cage. My ears strained, picking up the groan of the building settling, the distant hum of servers, the frantic beat of my own pulse against my eardrums. Then a chime, a new message. I clicked it open, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my ribs. Marcus, the colleague's message began polite, professional. I've reviewed my data. It's intriguing, certainly, statistically improbable, yes, but the conclusions I read drawing, they're quite a leap. Overwork, perhaps. We've all been pushing ourselves. Maybe a few days away from the screens, a change of scenery. My theories about unraveling reality and cosmic correction are, frankly, unscientific. There's no empirical basis for such claims. I suggest I reconsider my interpretation of the noise. Noise, they called it noise. My hands clenched, gripped tight against the desk. Noise, this wasn't noise. This was the precise, terrifying heartbeat of something ancient and vast. They didn't see it. They couldn't see it. Was it the sheer scale of the revelation that blinded them, or something else entirely? I typed back, my fingers flying, a desperate flood of words. I explained the pattern, the self-correcting nature of the signal, how it seemed to rewrite itself, subtly altering the very parameters of the data as I observed it. I begged them to look deeper, to trust my experience, my years of training. The reply was swift, almost immediate. Marcus, I understand I read under immense stress, but this is becoming concerning. I read describing subjective experiences, not objective data. If I continue down this path, it could jeopardize my standing, my research. I'm afraid I can't assist further with this line of inquiry. Please take a break. A break. The words felt like a slap. My standing, my research. What good were those if reality itself was being rewritten? They were deaf. They were blind, and I was alone, but I couldn't give up, not yet. I thought of the institution of the higher authorities, the ones who oversaw global scientific endeavors, the ones who dealt with threats on a planetary scale. I pulled up a contact. A bureau chief I'd met at a conference years ago, a stern, practical woman who valued facts and security above all else. This was a security threat, wasn't it? A threat to the very fabric of existence. I drafted a concise, formal request for an urgent meeting, omitting the more subjective details, focusing solely on the impossible signal, the statistical anomalies, the potential for a paradigm shift so profound it could destabilize everything. I used scientific terminology, carefully couched my language, hoping to appeal to their logic. I sent it, a silent prayer escaping my lips. The response came within hours, not from the bureau chief herself, but from a junior administrative assistant. "Dear Marcus," it read, "my request for an urgent meeting has been received. Due to the unusual nature of my claims, and in light of recent communications from my department head regarding my current stress levels, we recommend I follow up with internal support channels before pursuing external inquiries. My request has been filed for review at a later, unspecified date." Internal support channels, stress levels, my department head, they had already been contacted. My own department, alerted by the colleague, had already begun to isolate me. This wasn't just dismissal, it was a coordinated effort, subtle yet devastating. The correction wasn't just reshaping the cosmos, it was reshaping perception, twisting the very framework of human understanding, making the truth an impossibility to grasp for anyone but me. This was the terrible, horrifying reveal. The entity wasn't just changing the laws of physics, it was changing the laws of mind. They couldn't see it because they were already unknowingly part of the process. Their reality had already been subtly adjusted. I pushed back from my desk, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now, a violent tremor that resonated through my entire body. I stumbled to my feet, the fluorescent lights above buzzing with an almost malicious hum. I found myself driving, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, my mind a maelstrom of fear and desperate thoughts. I drove past the familiar routes, the towering buildings, the distant hum of humanity oblivious to its impending undoing. My destination was instinctual, a place of last resort, a sanctuary I hadn't truly entered in years. The old stone walls of the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years loomed out of the pre-dawn gloom, stark and ancient. The heavy oak doors, studded with iron, felt impossibly heavy under my trembling hand. I stood amidst the vacant pews, the faint scent of old incense and dust filling my lungs. No cosmic entity could touch this place, could it? This bastion of human faith built on foundations that predated modern science. But even here in the hallowed quiet, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air seemed to stir. And if even the sacred could be touched, where could I possibly turn? My department head's words still echoed, the hollow clatter of my isolation settling around me. This wasn't just dismissal. It was an excision, a surgical removal from the body of shared knowledge. They thought they were containing a problem, but I knew they were just sealing their eyes. My determination, however, had not wavered. If anything, it had hardened into a brittle, unyielding core. I packed a small bag, my hands moving with an unfamiliar economy. No time for sentimentality, no space for doubt. The apartment felt colder somehow. Not just the temperature, but the air itself, thin and sharp, as if reality was already beginning to fray at the edges. The street outside was quiet, too quiet for the middle of the day. A few vehicles passed, their engines sounding strangely muffled, their reflections on wet pavement warping in ways that defied physics, stretching and compressing in impossible patterns before snapping back to normal. My vision, I told myself, stress. But then I saw it. A news report flickered on a public screen embedded in a bus stop. The anchor's face was pale, strained, her words stumbling over each other. Reports of structural anomalies in several major cities, authorities urging calm. The image behind her showed what looked like the facade of a well-known skyscraper, but one of its corners had subtly, impossibly, bent inward. Not collapsed, not broken, but curved like clay, into an arc that no architect could ever conceive. This wasn't just my signal, this was its effect. The drive out of the city was a blur of growing unease. The radio, which I usually kept tuned to scientific broadcasts, now crackled with panicked static, occasionally breaking through with fragmented reports. A bridge in the north, its suspension cables appearing to ripple as if made of liquid. And then the disappearances. I gripped the steering wheel, my grip tight. It was a presence. It was the unraveling. The world was beginning to shed its skin of fundamental laws, revealing the incomprehensible truth beneath. My destination was miles outside the city, nestled in a valley that time seemed to have forgotten, the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years. I needed to be there. I didn't know why, not precisely, but a deep, primal instinct pulled me towards its weathered walls. Perhaps it was the only place left where the old ways, the old certainties, still held some faint resonance. As I drove, the landscape itself seemed to shift. Trees on the roadside appeared to shimmer, their leaves momentarily blurring into a single undulating mass before resolving back into individual forms. The road ahead would sometimes stretch, the perspective elongating unnaturally, only to snap back to its proper length with a jolt that sent shivers down my spine. My vision was not playing tricks. This was happening. Reality was thinning, becoming porous. I finally pulled the car onto the gravel path leading to the church, the crunch of the stones under the tires sounding unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. The ancient bell tower loomed against the bruised sky, its stone facade appearing different. Not structurally changed, but the very texture of the stone seemed to ripple, the individual blocks seeming to breathe, expanding and contracting with an imperceptible rhythm. I pushed open the heavy oak door. It groaned, a sound like a forgotten beast stirring from a long slumber. Inside, the silence was absolute, deeper than any silence I had ever known. It pressed in on my ears, a physical weight. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light filtering through the stained glass windows, but even these motes seemed to move with an erratic, unnatural grace, sometimes pausing midair, sometimes accelerating without cause. My breath plumed in front of me. I walked down the central aisle, my footsteps echoing too loudly, too many times, as if several versions of me were walking in unison, slightly out of sync. I stopped before the altar, its polished wood gleaming dully. As I stared at it, the figure of the suffering man seemed to subtly shift, his carved features twisting into an expression that was not pain, but something far older, far more alien. This wasn't just a signal. This was an entity, and it was here. I walked to the side, towards a small, heavy wooden door that led to the sacristy, a room where generations of my family had prepared for their sacred duties. Inside, rows of old vestments hung, their fabrics stiff with age. On a dusty shelf, nestled among forgotten hymnals and ledgers, was a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't just any journal. It was my great-great-grandfather's, a man known for his eccentric observations. I opened it, the brittle pages crinkling under my fingers. His elegant, looping script filled the pages, recounting sermons, parish news, and then slowly, meticulously, something else. Drawings, geometric patterns that were unsettlingly familiar, repeating symbols that mirrored the structure of the signal I had detected. It is not of this world. It seeks to mend the cracks, but in doing so, it will shatter the vessel. My great-great-grandfather had seen it. He had heard the hum, the signal. This was not a new phenomenon. It was merely new to us. The entity had been here observing, influencing, perhaps even shaping events for centuries, waiting for the opportune moment. The cracks he spoke of, the vessel, he understood something fundamental. The entity wasn't just unraveling reality, it was correcting it. Rectifying perceived imperfections in the fundamental laws of existence, and humanity was merely an inconvenient anomaly in its grand design. The global shifts, the temporal distortions, the disappearances, these were not random acts of chaos. They were deliberate, precise adjustments, and we were caught in the crosshairs of a cosmic architect. My hands trembled, the journal slipping slightly. I looked up around the ancient sacristy. I could feel its presence, a vast, indifferent intelligence pressing in on the fragile shell of this old church, on the fragile shell of my own mind. What else had my great-great-grandfather recorded in these pages? What terrible truth lay hidden in the faded ink, waiting to be rediscovered by a world that was already crumbling? The ancient timber of the church, where my family has been clergy for 400 years, groaned around me, a symphony of slow decay and forgotten prayers. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak morning light that pierced the grimy stained glass windows, each particle a tiny world spinning in a silent, golden current. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of aged incense, beeswax, and something metallic and cold, like a forgotten tomb open to the elements. My hyper-awareness, a cruel gift bestowed by the signal, made every creak of the floorboards beneath my boots feel like a hammer blow against my skull, every whisper of the wind through the eaves a shriek. I walked the nave, my gaze sweeping over the familiar pews, the altar, the intricately carved pulpit that had echoed with the voices of my ancestors for centuries. My great-great-grandfather's words, scribbled in the margins of a forgotten hymnal I'd found tucked away in the sacristy, clawed at the edges of my mind. The cracks, the vessel. What had he meant? What had he seen? It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a pressure. My eyes fixated on the altar, specifically on the ornate brass cross that stood upon it. As I stared, the cross seemed to ripple, its solid edges blurring for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. A trick of the light, I told myself, but my stomach twisted. The hum intensified, a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate the very air in my lungs. It felt wrong, as if its substance had been momentarily borrowed, then returned. I moved to the back of the church, to the small, dusty alcove where records were kept. Generations of births, deaths, marriages, and sermons. I pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle with age. My great-great-grandfather's distinctive, looping script filled the final entries. He hadn't just spoken of the hum, he had drawn it. Not as a sound wave, but as a series of impossibly complex, interlocking geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe on the page. They were patterns that defied Euclidean geometry, shapes that twisted space itself. As my fingers traced the lines, the hum grew louder, sharper, no longer a vibration but a distinct, invasive frequency. My vision blurred. The dust motes in the light became tiny, shimmering points of impossible luminescence, each one a miniature galaxy unfolding and collapsing. The air grew heavy, tasting of ozone and something indescribably ancient, like stone ground to powder by eons of friction. Then the cracks. They appeared first in the stained glass window above the altar, not as fractures in the glass itself, but as fissures in the very light passing through. The wooden beams supporting the roof began to warp, not physically bending, but perceptually shifting, their solid forms becoming fluid, their right angles dissolving into obtuse, then acute, then something utterly alien. The entire structure of the church, which had stood for centuries, began to unravel before my eyes, not collapsing, but dissolving into a symphony of contradictory perspectives. My breath hitched. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape. My hyper-awareness, once a tool, became a torment. I saw through the material world, past the familiar facade of wood and stone and glass. I saw the underlying fabric of existence, and it was thin, frayed, and behind it, pressing through the widening gaps, was it. It wasn't a shape I could comprehend, not truly. Imagine a concept made manifest, a thought given form that violated every law of perception. It was a shifting, non-Euclidean geometry of pure presence. It was vast beyond measure, yet seemed to fit within the confines of the church, as if the church itself were merely a projection of its internal architecture. A soundless roar filled my mind, not a sound heard by ears, but a direct download of intent, of purpose. The entity was not malicious, not evil in any human sense. It was correcting. It perceived the fundamental laws of our universe, space, time, causality as flaws, as imperfections in a grander design. It saw the cracks not as damage, but as opportunities to mend, to reshape, to bring everything into alignment with its own incomprehensible truth. It was unraveling reality not to destroy, but to perfect. And its perfection meant the annihilation of everything I understood, everything humanity had ever built upon. My knees buckled. A wave of nausea, so profound it felt like my very cells were turning themselves inside out, washed over me. I clamped my hands over my ears, though the roaring was inside my head, not external. My vision swam, the impossible geometry of the entity pressing in, threatening to consume my sanity, to remake my mind in its own image. I was a broken vessel, yes, but now I was filled to overflowing with a truth that tore at the threads of my being. The church continued its silent, impossible contortion. The altar seemed to stretch, growing impossibly tall, its surface becoming a vast, flat plane that curved away into an unseen horizon. The windows winked out of existence, replaced by swirling vortices of those alien colors. I was adrift in a sea of pure, unadulterated reality bending. What would remain of me once its corrections were complete? Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak morning light that pierced the grimy stained glass windows, each particle a tiny world spinning in a silent gold. A moment of stillness before the inevitable. I stood at the altar, my fingers tracing the cold, worn marble, a testament to generations of faith, now feeling like a hollow shell. My breath plumed in the chill air, a ghost of my own defiance. I had come here not for solace, but for clarity, for a final, desperate understanding of the signal's true intent. A low thrum began, not from the ancient organ, nor from the distant rumble of the city, but from deep within the very stone beneath my feet. It was a vibration I felt more than heard, a frequency that resonated with the marrow of my bones. The dust motes, once dancing, now shimmered, caught in an unseen current. The light through the stained glass shifted, the familiar blues and reds bleeding into shades I couldn't name, colors that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My vision swam. The air itself thickened, pressing in on my chest. It was like breathing through a heavy velvet curtain, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a shallow gasp. My ears popped, a dull pressure building behind my eyes. The thrum intensified, becoming a pervasive hum that filled the church, a sound without source, without direction. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, a silent roar. The stained glass windows, those vibrant narratives of saints and scripture, began to ripple. Not shattering, not breaking, but bending, as if the very glass had become fluid. The images distorted, stretching, pulling into elongated, unfamiliar forms. The figures twisted, their benevolent expressions morphing into something alien, a silent, painted scream. My stomach churned. A wave of profound nausea swept over me, leaving me weak and trembling. I sank to my knees, the cold stone floor radiating the pervasive hum. The timbered ceiling above me began to twist, the ancient beams no longer straight but subtly curved, their angles shifting, defying geometry. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse, but without the sound of splintering wood or falling debris. Everything was silent, just this pervasive, unnerving hum. My eyes darted around, trying to find an anchor, a single familiar point in the dissolving reality. But there was none. Outside, beyond the rippling glass, the world was changing. I could no longer discern the familiar outline of the bell tower or the distant rooftops of the town. The trees in the churchyard, their branches once stark against the horizon, now seemed to unfurl into impossible fractal patterns, their leaves not green but a strange, metallic gray. They were not dying, they were transforming, reordering into something profoundly different. My breath hitched. This was it, the correction. Not an explosion, not a cataclysm, but a silent, indifferent resculpting of existence. It was not violent, but utterly consuming. My own body felt strange, disconnected. My hands, still pressed to the altar, seemed to blur at the edges, my fingers elongating, becoming less distinct. I tried to move, to stand, but my muscles felt like they were made of sand, resisting my will. The air grew heavy with an unfamiliar scent, like ozone and dust, but also something else, something metallic and utterly sterile, devoid of life. The very atoms of the church, of the world, were being rearranged. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the fundamental fabric of everything around me. The wooden pews stretched, their grain lines now flowing like water, their solid forms becoming indistinct. The statues of saints in their niches melted, their stone features dissolving into abstract shapes, then reforming into structures that defied human recognition, angular and smooth, reflecting the alien light from outside. I was watching the world unmake itself, not to be destroyed, but to be remade into something utterly alien. Humanity, its cities, its history, its very memory was simply being overwritten, edited out of the cosmic equation. We were never meant to be. The entity, in its incomprehensible wisdom, was simply tidying up, returning reality to a state it deemed correct. My lungs burned. My head throbbed. The ancient church, my family's sanctuary, was now a gateway to oblivion. And I was still here, a terrified, helpless observer. What would remain of me when the correction was complete? Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak morning light that pierced the grimy stained glass windows, each particle a tiny world spinning in a silent gold. I watched them, my breath shallow, the chill of the stone floor seeping into my bones. The air, usually thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax, felt thin, hollowed out. A profound emptiness had settled, not just in the nave, but within the very fabric of the space. My gaze drifted to the altar, a heavy slab of oak worn smooth by generations of hands. It looked different somehow, not physically altered, but conceptually, as if its purpose had been subtly, irrevocably shifted. The crucifix above it seemed to twist in my peripheral vision, its angles momentarily sharpening into something impossible, then snapping back. My eyes burned. Had the deprivation finally broken me, or was this the subtle tremor before the quake? I pushed myself to my feet, the effort costing me more than it should. My knees ached. My muscles felt like stretched wires. I took a step, then another, the soles of my shoes scraping faintly on the flagstones. The sound seemed to be absorbed, instantly muted, as if the air itself had become too dense to carry vibrations. What was happening to the acoustics of this sacred space? A low hum began, not from the ancient organ, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated in my teeth, a low thrumming that resonated deep in my inner ear. The dust motes, previously dancing, now moved with an unnatural synchronicity, like a swarm of insects following an unseen conductor. The slivers of light through the stained glass no longer seemed to illuminate. They seemed to extract color, leaving the world around me subtly desaturated, muted. The vibrant blues and reds of the saints on the glass bled into a uniform, sickly ochre. I stumbled, catching myself on a pew. The wood felt rough, splintered, yet oddly soft, yielding beneath my palm. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching stillness. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant tone that felt like a fundamental frequency of existence being plucked. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but one I felt with every nerve ending, every cell. It was the sound of the correction. The entity wasn't just a signal. It wasn't a message. It was a principle, a cosmic imperative. It had identified the universe, our reality, as an anomaly, a chaotic sprawl of unnecessary complexity. And it was simplifying, rectifying. The grand design of existence was being rewritten, not with fire and brimstone, but with an appalling, elegant precision. The infinite variations, the beautiful imperfections, the very essence of what made things, all were being smoothed away. My vision blurred. The walls of the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years began to ripple, not like water, but like a faulty projection. The rough-hewn stone dissolved into a shimmering, indistinct haze, then solidified again, each time slightly less detailed, less there. The carved wooden angels on the pulpit, their faces once serene, now appeared featureless, smoothed into blank ovals. The intricate patterns of the altar cloth flattened, losing their texture, becoming a simple, unadorned plane. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to steady the kaleidoscopic fracturing of my perception. This was not madness. This was observation. The universe was shedding its layers, discarding the nuanced physics, the intricate biological structures, the very concept of individual identity as superfluous. It was returning to a state of pure, undifferentiated potential, a blank slate where nothing truly existed, and therefore nothing could be flawed. My mind, a complex tapestry of memories and deductions, felt like it was being unspooled thread by thread. My name, Marcus, felt like a foreign word, an unnecessary label. The hum swelled, an unbearable pressure against my skull. I fell to my knees, gasping for air that felt increasingly insubstantial. The outlines of the pews, the columns, the very floor beneath me began to dissolve. They weren't vanishing, they were merging, becoming indistinguishable from one another, from the air, from me. My own hands, held before my face, shimmered, the distinct lines of my fingers, the texture of my skin, softened, blurred. I could see through them, not to the church, but to the same uniform grayness that was consuming everything. My thoughts fragmented, scattering like the dust motes. Marcus, the name held no meaning. Astrophysicist, a meaningless profession in a universe without stars, without laws. Humanity, a collection of ephemeral complexities destined for nullification. And the entity was merely balancing the ledger, returning everything to its pristine, uncomplicated state. My body began to dissipate, not painfully, but with an unsettling grace. My perception of self, the ego, the individual spark, diffused into the pervasive grayness. I was no longer Marcus. I was no longer anything distinct. What remained of the church where my family has been clergy for 400 years was no longer a structure, but a concept, a memory, swiftly fading. The dust motes, the last vestiges of individual particles, slowed, then stopped. They no longer danced. They simply were, suspended in the infinite, undifferentiated, luminous gray. And I, too, was simply being, a whisper in the newly corrected void.